hello, welcome to everyone, and what a joy it is to be joining you all. Before I get into my talk, I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that I'm on today, and also the lands that you're all joining us from today. I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri Wurrung people of the Kulin Nations, and I'd like to pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and also pay respects to the traditional owners and elders of the communities that you're all joining us from today, and acknowledge that the work that we do as educators, as brokers of change, and as people who are genuinely concerned about education and community is often in strong and close solidarity with Aboriginal people and also Aboriginal young people in particular. So I'm really overjoyed to be with you today. It's obviously a chance to celebrate 20 years of applied learning and the wonderful work that I know so many of you do, and so many have done before us as well. I'm the chair of the 31 local learning and employment networks. We refer to ourselves as the Victorian Lens, and we love acronyms, VALA, LENS, VCAL, and what's really important though is how we get beyond the acronyms to what the core of our work is all about, and what unites us and what drives us to continue to do better. So the title of my talk is Positive Disruption, and I've borrowed this term from a dear friend and a mentor and one of the founders of the Lens, Howard Kelly. Howard Kelly was the project director of the Kirby Review and had a long and distinguished career in education, working in tech schools, in government schools, and in really interesting and robust environments before he found his way into the departmental bureaucracy to be the project director for the Kirby Review. And the Kirby Review, as some of you would know, really was the cornerstone of reform in 2000, 2001. And the term positive disruption is a term that I've heard Howard use on a number of occasions, because the way that he thinks about and describes the work of both the Lens and of applied learning educators, VCAL teachers, VCAL coordinators, and even some principals and people within the bureaucracy, is that we have to be constantly positively disrupting the mainstream. And it's a really interesting idea, because a lot of what we see through any reform process is actually an attempt to consolidate, to firm up, to lock things down and to finalise things. And yet the story of the last 20 years, and particularly the basis of both VCAL and also the Lens, which have at their core the same foundation, is this notion that those who are disruptive in the classroom deserve more. Those who are disruptive in the school grounds need more. And those who aren't necessarily disruptive but can disrupt the economy deserve the best chance to try things out, to make a difference, and to be their best self. My background, as Helene mentioned, involves working with young people and organisations in the juvenile justice system, as well as through applied learning contexts, including in adult education. And one of the things that I've always found as a fascinating element is that this notion that we need to, and this is another Howard Kelly term, make good trouble. So the idea that someone who doesn't fit in, someone who is looking for more, is given an opportunity to express themselves and to try things out, is for me at the core of what we're all about, which is giving every young person the best chance they can to thrive and succeed. So we're celebrating this year 20 years of putting young people at the centre through applied learning and place-based partnerships, and that for us is something that we share and are very pleased to share this celebration this year with VALA and Helene and her whole team, and of course all of you who are part of a very strong community across the state. And I thought it might be useful for us to travel back in time to actually understand the basis of where we have been and what we are celebrating, which also helps, I think, set the basis of where we are going and where we need to go, and the challenge that's before all of us. So traveling back in time, I'm not sure how many of you have ever read a ministerial review or a parliamentary report, but for me this is essential reading, and this is the Ministerial Review of Post-Compulsory Education and Training Pathways in Victoria, otherwise known as the Kirby Report. And the Kirby Report really laid the foundation for applied learning and for place-based partnerships, which is what the Lens have had a strong focus on for 20 years. And it really validated those two things and said that these things are absolutely essential to the future of the education system and the training system in Victoria. But what's interesting is that the basis of this report, and this report was under the Bracks government, and obviously Minister Koski, the late Minister Koski, was the absolute driver in relation to this work, was this notion that we needed a broader commitment of government, community and industry to really support young people and their future pathways, and that there was the forces of globalisation really marching at a much quicker pace, but also that there were challenges in our own economy and our own opportunity for young people, and that there were young people who were slipping through the cracks. And those of you that were in the education system, were teachers or involved in other ways at this time, may remember that this was a period of significant reform, but also significant opportunity. So I wanted to, and I don't expect you to read all this, but these slides will be available. But what I wanted to really bring to our attention is the fact that the questions that are before us at the moment, the questions that we're grappling with the Firth Review, the reform of senior secondary pathways, and also the Macklin Review, which is looking at the training system and the education system more generally, is that the same questions that we're grappling with now are the same questions we were grappling with 20 years ago and even 20 years before then. At the core, the reforms 20 years ago were acknowledging that different types of learners need different sorts of things, that communities and industries are critical to supporting young people and their schools to make their way through a rapidly changing world. And with economic and social change happening both across the globe 20 years ago and even now again today, those communities of interest, those whole of community responses, are absolutely essential for young people's wellbeing as well as their pathways. So the other thing that's probably critical to highlight when it came to the Kirby reforms was this notion that there was already great work happening. This was not the basis of the government said, let's do something different, let's do something new. There were amazing things happening, and many of you I know would have been involved in those things, those local partnerships between community, industry and school to support young people. Those applied learning programs that popped up not because government said we need to have this, but because a community or a school or educators said we need this for our kids. And so the Kirby reforms really built on the grassroots work that had taken place for many years. I myself came from a senior secondary school, Swinburne Senior Secondary College, which was a year 11 and 12 school that was all about applied learning and was a place to capture students that were not fitting into the mainstream. And what's interesting is that if we look at any education setting, there were the seeds of VCAL and applied learning in so many different contexts in Melbourne and across the state. There's obviously also the critical reflection that there were the partnerships that were taking place already were a recognition that people wanted to make a difference in the lives of young people, that with the decline of manufacturing and the loss of jobs across the sector, there was an opportunity here to do something different and to build new pathways for young people in new and emerging jobs. And so that really sat at the core of these reforms. And this is, for me, is a really interesting piece of research. This was from a paper that was produced just after the Kirby reforms were adopted. And effectively it drew together both the Lens and also VCAL as two critical reforms that would set up Victoria's future and young people's future in Victoria. Why I wanted to highlight this particular piece of research is that what it also did is that it raised the question about how we fund these things and the importance of parity when it came to ensuring that applied learning was valued from both a government investment point of view, but also from a community involvement point of view, alongside VCE and alongside traditional mainstream education. And this notion of parity and this notion that applied learning is valid, it is something which must be embraced, it is something which is absolutely essential to our future, is for me the critical question that we have before us right now. As we start to go into a new phase of reform with the Firth Review and the Firth reforms. This notion of applied learning, whether it's to support the needs of students to go into industries, or whether it's to support those young people who have not been disconnected, but education has not connected with them in a traditional sense, and they need something different. That's not the fault of a young person, that is actually the fault of the system, having not adapted and flexed to the needs of those young people. So these reforms that we see right now are in many ways the next chapter, or could be the next chapter in the work that Kirby did 20 years ago. At the critical point though, the question that is before all of us and before us 20 years ago and 20 years before that and today is this question that is in the minds of so many of us, which is that we just want to give this kid a go. We just want to give this young person the best chance to be themselves and to thrive in a rapidly changing world. And for me, that's what the core work of LENS are. LENS are local learning and employment networks. We're effectively the collaboration of individuals, of organisations, of businesses and communities, of educators, of people who care about young people and their future and believe with complete passion and conviction that the outcomes for young people are everyone's business. And how we make that happen and how we continue to make that happen is for us a constant source of challenge. So I asked myself this question: what does LEN work look like today compared to 20 years ago? 20 years ago, we were holding think tanks, summits, doing reports, having lots of meetings. We love meetings, but we're also building on programs that existed or had found their foundation somewhere. In my own LEN, which is in the Central Ranges area, which is not really a geographic area as such, it's more a place where there's a weather system, the Central Ranges, you might hear about on the weather reports. And it's also, of course, something in Lenland. So it is the Macedon Ranges, Mitchell and Murrindindi. In my area, we had to tackle this question a number of years ago, back in 2017, and we conceived of a program which effectively was all about trying to keep students engaged at year 10 and so that they could actually make their way into VCAL. We were finding that the rate of students dropping out of the system, disengaging from education at 2 of our schools was increasing, and we didn't see this as necessarily the fault of the school or students or anyone. It was no one's fault. What it was, though, was an opportunity to do something different. And in some respects, we just built on the work that so many applied learning educators who come before us had done. And so we talked about the importance of hands-on learning, of work readiness, of personal development, of putting the young person at the centre, and recognising that if what they were doing outside of school was holding a spray can in their hand and engaging in some sort of unofficial public art, that we needed to go to where they were and that we needed to build programs that valued who they were, what they were interested in, and positively disrupted the school and the education system to give them a chance to fit in, or rather to get the system to fit around them. And for us, that's been a core element of our work. The reason why I mention this is because for me, this is absolutely essential to the work that is before us. One thing that we've learned over the last few years running this program, and this is one of those examples of where a program started with 2 schools as a pilot, and now a few years later is a vocational education and training program aligned to a Certificate 2 in active volunteering. It's run for over 200 students across Victoria. It's run in 20 schools in partnership with 7 LENS, and meets the needs of students in inclusive education, students who are disengaged or disconnected, students who are just looking for something that's a bit more applied, a bit more real world, or that enables them to form a relationship back with their school. And for us, this is really a critical point, because one of the questions that we are now asking is, how do we ensure that the good things that we do, good programs like this and so many other things just like it across the state, the wonderful programs that engage young parents, how do we ensure that those things continue and remain strong as we go through these new reforms? How do we ensure that those things that we love, that we value, and that we know work, actually continue to make a difference in the lives of young people? The fact that we do have students, that we do have young people who have thrived in applied learning and applied education is, I think, the strongest evidence that what you do is so critical, not just to the lives of these young people, but to society as a whole. For every young person who has the opportunity to access applied learning, who's supported by a place-based partnership that sees industry, community, educators and others come together and wrap themselves around that young person. Every time we do that, we are actually making a difference to our entire society, because we are enabling a young person to get through those difficult stages of adolescence, to transition to adulthood, and hopefully to be the person that they are always meant to be. So for me, this is the critical question. I think for the Lens, this is the question that we are constantly asking ourselves and asking government. How do we ensure that the things that are so important, those models of communities and partnerships around young people, continue regardless of what the curriculums are called, regardless of what the pathway is described as, regardless of whether it's called VCE, vocational or VCAL or whatever it might be, that those things that continue are privileged, are prioritised and are properly funded. And for us, that is a critical question going forward. So I throw down, I suppose, the challenge, and I just wanted to show some of the wonderful images of what that looks like for us. I throw down the challenge: how do we ensure that these things, we continue to see these sorts of things happening in our schools and in our communities across the state over the next decade and beyond? The opportunity for students who don't feel that they fit to find a place, the opportunity for communities and industry to be positively disruptive in the classroom, in the education system, and with schools together in partnership is absolutely the critical question that we all face. Diverse young people who already face significant barriers to employment and education, how do we ensure that their needs are met and that they're not put in the corner? My LEN operates out of a building that was once the VCAL Centre, and at the time, the VCAL Centre was basically a place where the students that were a bit disruptive were put in a program, and it was not given the priority that it was. I'm pleased to say that model has shifted and models change, and VCAL is absolutely a priority in that school now. And for me, that's a recognition that these things, good things, can get better. Hard things can be improved. But what is absolutely essential is that we continue to talk about keeping young people at the centre. We know, and I think this is the work that you all do, we know that when young people are given the skills, the tools and the opportunities, they can do amazing things. And the critical question that I would like to leave you with, and I, in fact, would also ask you to keep putting to not just to Lens and to businesses and industry, and also to our political leaders, because they need to hear this from us, is how do we make sure that we continue to keep that focus on applied learning, on place-based partnerships, build on the strengths that we have, build on the great work that's happened. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but rather build on the incredible foundation that doesn't just go back 20 years. In fact, it goes back much longer, and creates that positive disruption, an education system that continually allows for positive disruption and allows us all to make good travel going into the future. Thanks very much. I'll end it there.